Hi. Of all the weather phenomena most feared by GA pilots, fog, icing, strong winds and so on, the one that seems to scare people most is thunderstorms. In this video, I'd like to help you think about when and whether to fly if there's a risk or forecast of thunderstorms. Just like in the icing video, I won't cover the theory. There are so many resources out there already, both in text and video, that if you want to know what gives rise to thunderstorms, yes, the pun is intentional, what they consist of, or the dangers within, please have a look at those. This is just going to be about practicalities. The practicalities of forecasting them, evaluating them, avoiding them, and surviving them. Now, again, as in the icing video, I've a delicate path to tread between reinforcing the message you've been given throughout your training, that thunderstorms are very nasty indeed and you mustn't go into them or close to them, but also to say that the reality is that, in Northern Europe anyway, they're usually survivable and the experience of being in one is not quite as bad as advertised. Now, that's not true in the middle of the United States. A severe thunderstorm in the band between South Dakota and Texas is likely to kill you. The same goes for the tropics, particularly in Central Africa and the Amazon. Even in Italy, over the Alps and Apennines, they can be dangerous. But for the bulk of PPLIR members flying in Northern Europe, we're unlikely to encounter a thunderstorm so bad that we may as well fold our arms and accept our fates. I guess that in my career I've accidentally penetrated maybe 5 to 8 thunderstorms in aircraft from AA5B through light twins to executive jets, and I'm not only here to tell the tale, but the experience was nowhere near as bad as the books say. That's not to encourage you to fly in a way that increases your risk of thunderstorm penetration, but only to say that if you do accidentally end up in one and you fly carefully and gently, you're probably going to survive with no damage to the aircraft and just have a story for the club bar. Many experienced IFR pilots have, at one time or another, for reasons of equipment failure, misjudgment or lack of alternative, ended up in a thunderstorm and have lived to tell the tale. You certainly shouldn't deliberately plan to penetrate a thunderstorm, and, with modern equipment and the advice in this video, there's every reason why you should not accidentally penetrate one. Another confusion I want to address is between CBs and thunderstorms. Thunderstorms are a meteorological phenomenon within a large CB, and while it's not particularly pleasant to fly in any CBs carry many of the same features as thunderstorms, but a CB is by definition any bubbly cloud producing rain. Usually bumpy and noisy with rain beating on the windscreen, not where you want to take nervous or inexperienced passengers, but, unless you get a lot of icing, not particularly threatening. Particularly at the flight planning stage, many pilots see a binary split where a thunderstorm is deadly, any other CB or towering cumulus is benign. But in reality, there's an increasing ice and turbulence risk from fluffy cumulus to towering cumulus to CB to thunderstorms to supercells and tropical storms. And somewhere along that line of increasing energy, and for a given combination of pilot and aircraft, things do indeed become deadly. Whether you're looking at CBs or thunderstorms, another way of looking at their energy and hence their dangers is by the altitude of their tops. Again, this is a sliding scale, not a binary split. But if the tops are in the low to mid-20s, say up to 25,000 feet, they're likely to be less fierce than if they extend up to the high 20s and mid-30s. Some weather charts don't distinguish between CBs and thunderstorms. It's up to you to gauge from the altitude of the tops how likely they are to be dangerous or unpleasant. Also, I've mentioned that thunderstorms vary a lot around the world, but they also vary within their own lifetimes. They start reasonably benign, with some vertical drafts but no rain, hail or lightning. Then, as they grow into towering cumulus, they start to rain. This is when it's become a CB. But serious vertical drafts, tornadoes, microbursts, thunder, lightning and hail only start when they mature and begin to dissipate. Without going into detail, we've all been taught that the dangers of thunderstorms are hail damage, turbulence, which is a problem for both holding altitude and the risk of structural damage, water ingestion leading to possible flame out, and distracting noise, as well as dangers beneath and near thunderstorms such as downdrafts, microbursts, wind shear, hail, and in the extreme, tornadoes. Both flight planning when there are thunderstorms about and avoidance in flight require practice, not just theory. I hope in this video to give some hints from my 50 years experience. That's not to say that I'm an expert. No one except experimental test pilots go into or even near thunderstorms deliberately. But I've been at this a while and some of my experience may be helpful. So let's start with the forecast. The core principle is that the location, timing and even existence of a thunderstorm is very difficult, not possible really, to forecast accurately even on the day. However, we can get a reasonable indication of the likelihood of convective activity in advance. This is because we can forecast the conditions for thunderstorms, lifting plus moisture. Why are thunderstorms difficult to forecast? I think a useful analogy is starting a piston engine. We all know that all you need to start an engine is air, fuel, spark, and a jolt to get it moving. But in any particular conditions, with the engine at any particular temperature, with the fuel at any particular temperature, with any particular priming, is that engine going to start first blade, 20th blade, or not at all? I've started a piston engine very approximately 10,000 times, and although I can say vaguely an injected engine starts sooner when it's cold than when it's hot, I can't make any precise prediction. The engine needs the right conditions and a jolt to start, and so does a thunderstorm. Even then, we don't know whether it will start from a particular jolt. What does this mean for flying? It means we have to see and avoid thunderstorms whenever menacing conditions are forecast. If we cannot guarantee to see the thunderstorms with our eyes, we need to see them electronically. So let's look at flight planning for the general location of thunderstorms. Grommet, windy, TAFs and old school charts are all useful ways of alerting you to the risk of thunderstorms. There is a difference between air mass, orographic and frontal thunderstorms. Air mass thunderstorms are local and temporary and can be kicked off by a factory chimney anywhere pretty much at random. Whole areas are unlikely to be blocked out. They blow with the wind or the air mass, so their movement is predictable from their previous track. An airport is only likely to be unavailable for a short time. Orographic thunderstorms are generally static, can last for hours, can extend along a whole mountain range, but can be relied on not to move away from the topography that gave rise to them. Once they develop, they're quite easy to fly round, but they can suddenly appear without much warning and become quite violent quite quickly. Frontal thunderstorms move with the front, so their movement can be tracked and predicted, but they can extend for hundreds of miles, so can involve very long or impossible detours, and you either have to pick your way between them with radar or storm scope, or simply land and wait. Lifted index, Li, is a measure of the temperature difference between a lifted parcel of air and its surroundings. The higher the Li, meaning the closer to zero, the less likely a thunderstorm. Though don't be fooled, Li is expressed as a negative number, so the larger the number, albeit negative, the more likely is a thunderstorm. Yeah, quite, go figure. If you want to forecast the chances of thunderstorms more than a few hours in advance, you need a combination of Li and moisture content. It's possible to get a strong Li with no thunderstorm, or even any precipitation, but in northern Europe there's pretty much always moisture about, so Li isn't a bad proxy. Using windy and other products, there are now direct thunderstorm forecasts, and it might be best to go to them in preference. But if you are relying on Li, the rules of thumb are: if the Li is above minus 0.5, thunderstorms are unlikely. Between minus 0.5 and minus 3.5, they're possible. Between minus 3.5 and minus 5.5, probable. Minus 5.5 to minus 6.5 expect severe thunderstorms, and anything less than minus 6.5, that is to say a bigger negative number, expect violent thunderstorms. As I've said in previous videos, Autorouter's Grommet is great, and when you see a notable Li on a Grommet, it's good as an alerting tool. It tells you where on your planned route you're forecast to encounter areas at risk of thunderstorm activity. There's a gotcha with Gramet, which is that with air mass thunderstorms in particular, a significant LI can be shown with a completely clear blue sky with no indication of cloud. If you don't notice and interpret correctly the LI symbol, this can sucker you into thinking it's going to be a perfect clear day. However, Gramet is a vertical slice. But because the main tool of avoidance is to turn, it's more important to get a sense of the forecast horizontal area of thunderstorm activity. Windy has a couple of different forms of direct thunderstorm forecast. One is based on LI, humidity and probably other factors to give a general view on where thunderstorms can be expected. The other is actual radar and gives a very short timescale but a relatively more accurate idea of where cells might move. It's worth remembering that the turbulence and vertical currents created by a thunderstorm are not generally visible. We use two analogues, precipitation and lightning strikes. Weather radar, whether ground-based or onboard, detects atmospheric moisture. Droplet size is proportional to convection and therefore a proxy for the strength of a cell. Onboard radar doesn't detect frozen precipitation, so returns from hail are generally very weak and not of much use for hail avoidance in flight. Lightning strikes are detected by their recognizable radiomagnetic signature. While we cannot see the turbulence, the bit we're most concerned about, heavy rain, hail and strikes, will so often accompany it that radar and strike detection are a good way to see where the cells are, individually and even better in combination. Seeing how areas of thunderstorms are forecasted to develop during the day and how they're forecast to move can be very helpful in flight planning, but remember that good graphics do not mean an accurate forecast. These forecasts need to be treated as a guide. Gramet and Windy are the new way, but there's still plenty of room for the old ways, charts and TAFs. Because thunderstorms are not possible to forecast accurately, charts and TAFs tend to over-forecast. Indeed, in my days of flying around the Soviet Union, I remember every TAF, even the most benign, ending Prob 10 TS. I suspect that was because no one was ever sent to the Gulag for forecasting a thunderstorm which never happened, but failing to do so might well have had that result. However, there is some human expertise going into a TAF, and that expertise can be a useful guide to timing. It's generally agreed that the TAF format, which was designed for cloud-based and wind, is not suited to forecasting convective weather, but because forecasting is so hit and miss with thunderstorms, actuals are your friend. METARs and ground radar tell you what's going on right now, without any doubt. While on the ground, while flight planning, even very shortly before takeoff, you can see ground radar on many sites as well as strikes. I would just put Weather Radar Europe into Google and see which interface you like best. I like blitzordnung.org for strikes. It gives a beautifully dramatic rendering of every lightning strike as it happens. This is the time that you have to take the decision as to whether to launch into the conditions you're seeing. How confident are you that you'll be able to see the thunderstorms, whether with your own eyes or electronically? If you are confident of seeing them, will you be able to find a route around or between them, or is there a risk of becoming surrounded? Are the thunderstorms embedded in other cloud at the levels at which you'll be flying, making allowances for ATC not necessarily giving you your planned level? If they are embedded, can you detect them electronically? Let's move on to avoidance in flight. The core principle is that we need to avoid thunderstorm cells by a considerable margin. Because of various errors inherent in the various detection systems in terms of latency and timing, direction of travel, speed of growth, turbulence beyond the core and so on, we just don't have good enough data to skim past cells. Avoidance needs to be the sum of the factors of size of thunderstorm plus rate of development plus error in seeing, e.g. latency of weather radar images, onboard radar limitations such as shading and masking. Looking at the various tools in our box, nothing beats visual avoidance. If individual storms stand out against a beautiful blue background with crisp edges, then flying between them, with clearance from ATC, is easy. For air mass thunderstorms in northwest Europe, one can often get good visibility by getting on top of most of the weather and being able to clear the shoulders of the CBs. Typically, flight level 120 to 150 will suffice. Do remember that the direction of travel is not intuitive. We are used to hair or smoke blowing downwind, so we might think that the anvil is the trailing edge, but it in fact shows the direction the wind is pushing the storm. However, we are generally being moved in the same air mass, so if you forget about the drift and just point the nose such that you're going to miss the cloud, that generally works. If we cannot be sure to be able to see the clouds, we need to see them electronically. As most of us are not blessed with internet in flight, the next best thing is to get satellite downloads of weather radar and strikes. As far as I know, there are only two solutions available in Europe, Goltzer and Garmin Connects. They essentially achieve the same result, but at significantly different cost and marginally different utility. Connects is much more expensive, both in terms of capital and running costs, than Goltzer. It has the advantage that it presents directly on your navigator and on some MFDs, and also offers 5-minute updates rather than Goltzer's 15 minutes. Goltzer, on the other hand, will show on 4Flight, SkyDemon and some other iPad apps. I've flown with both, and though Connects is a little better, I personally would not consider the difference worth paying for. Both these ground-based weather solutions provide information on convective activity, precipitation and strikes, but they cannot be used for tactical avoidance in the way airborne radar can, because they're always out of date. I'm not sure of the timings for Connects, but I imagine they're similar to Goltzer, and Goltzer is never less than 4 minutes out of date, and, if everything is working correctly, not more than 19 minutes. The time of the reading is shown on the screen. You can use the play function to watch the progress and therefore make a reasonable projection of the movement over the 20 minutes following the last update. As I said earlier, thunderstorms grow and dissipate as well as move, so you really have no certainty, but you can make some very educated guesses. At the very least, I head for the trailing edge of the heavy rain. I can be fairly certain that it will have moved somewhat before I arrive, but I'm going to get as close as I dare without risking getting into the next cell. If circumstances are more critical, I'll actually plot on the screen the timing of the movement of a gap between the cells against my ETA for being in the gap, and work out exactly where I should be heading. This is best done with SkyDemon or 4Flight overlay, as you can rubber band your route using the position of the weather. However, this is effectively using the information tactically, which I just said you shouldn't do. It's really a question of doing whatever's necessary, using whatever facilities you have to make the best decisions. One bit of personal experience I'll add in here. I used to have my Goltzer unit wired into the avionics bus, protected only by a fuse. Like all electronics, on one occasion it froze, and of course it was when I was surrounded by thunderstorms. The only way I had of recycling it was by switching off the avionics master. I had to negotiate to leave controlled airspace, switch the avionics off and on again, much to the amusement of the airline pilots on the same frequency, as you can imagine, and rejoin. I had the unit wired into the circuit breaker, not that it's happened since, of course. While I've gone off at a tangent talking about avionics, it's probably worth mentioning that while modern touchscreen avionics work beautifully in normal weather, in turbulence they can become much more difficult than traditional push-button design, despite the hand grips which are supposed to steady your hand. This probably isn't a reason in itself to stick with legacy equipment, but if you're teetering on a decision, it's another factor to take into account. Much more immediate and tactical than relayed ground radar is airborne radar. It gives a near real-time view of thunderstorms ahead of you and within an arc, typically 60 degrees either side of the nose. It does allow you to pick away between cells with a high level of accuracy and confidence. It has shortcomings, as I'll explain in a moment, but it's pretty good, and ideally everyone flying IFR would carry it. But it carries considerable financial, weight, space and maintenance burdens, and is simply not available to those of us not made of money or in smaller, lighter, less capable aircraft. If you do have it, lucky you. When operated correctly, it gives great reassurance, utility, comfort and safety. You can use it not only to see the intensity of the rain and hail, but also to get an idea of the altitude of the tops, not only another measure of severity, but also to see whether you can remain on top of the storms. But to make the most of radar, you need to be properly trained, and you can find yourself constantly fiddling to get the best information out of it, getting rid of ground returns and interpreting tops and what lies ahead. When I used to fly two crew, it was not uncommon in severe weather for one pilot to fly the aircraft while the other one flies the radar. That's not possible single crew, of course, but does demonstrate how distracting it can be. While airborne radar paints a reasonable picture of the weather for many tens of miles ahead, it does suffer from masking and shadowing, meaning that nearer cells stop you seeing what's behind, so you can get a bit of a shock as you go round the corner. Don't get me wrong, airborne radar is great, but it's not perfect and it's not available to everyone. The third onboard technology I'll discuss is StormScope. There's also a similar technology called Strike Finder, but I've got no experience of it. StormScope is a passive receiver of the radiomagnetic signature of a lightning discharge within clouds, striking the ground and between cells. StormScope has a certain amount of intelligence which allows it not only to report where it detects strikes, but also to interpret what it's seeing, to estimate where cells are located. StormScope is real-time, so it has that advantage over Goltzer and Connext, but it only reports turbulence where it's become electric, and if you rely solely on StormScope, you can still end up in some very serious turbulence and heavy precipitation which has not quite made it to producing lightning and thunder. I can tell you from much experience that it's common to see cells of the heaviest rain or wet hail on weather radar without any accompanying lightning strikes, and therefore quite transparent to StormScope. Thus, radar gives a much earlier warning of building convective activity than a StormScope. Once it's on StormScope, it's full on. I fly with a combination of Goltzer radar and StormScope, which I think gives the best of all worlds without the costs and weight sacrifice of onboard radar. If you don't have onboard thunderstorm detection and yet are still flying on a day when CBs are around, there are two other resources which may be able to help. In some countries, ATC radar will detect weather and will help you, whether when you ask or sometimes on their own initiative. I can't give you a list of which do and which don't, but I can tell you that Germany definitely does show weather and will warn you, whereas in the UK weather is suppressed and they have no ability to tell you. And, finally, one method which I think will work in theory, though I've never actually tried, but might be worth a go in extremis, is to use your traffic detection system, whether TAS or ADS-B, to follow where other better equipped traffic is going. If you hear a call sign asking for a turn to avoid weather, and you can see where they are, you could ask for a heading towards where they seem to be going. This is a technique used by commercial air transport, but remember they have better capability to deal with adverse weather than most of us, so they could be leading you into conditions you can't cope with. If all else fails, it might be worth a try. Now, let's discuss what you do in controlled airspace when you can see that your track is going to be uncomfortably close to a cell. You should express your wishes as request 10 or 20 or whatever degrees left or right to avoid. ATC finds it very useful to know for how many miles you need the deviation. You can either volunteer that information in the first call, request 15 degrees right for 30 miles to avoid, or wait for them to ask. Whether they ask or not will depend on the airspace, traffic and the individual controller. Sometimes you just don't know how long you'll need the change, in which case make a guess and either tell them it's approximate or just keep it to yourself and tell them later as the situation becomes clearer. If there's a big storm right in front of you and you're happy to go either way, just tell them, request 15 degrees left or right to avoid. They will almost invariably grant your request. They understand the dangers as you do. However, if they don't, you could offer a level change if that makes a turn possible, and if that fails, you may have to declare an emergency and announce your new heading. What you must not do is allow yourself to go into a thunderstorm because ATC gives you no option. Under those circumstances, you must exercise your rights and privileges as the commander of the aircraft and leave ATC to sort it out. I've never had that in 50 years of IFR flying, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. The one thing I have had was when I was outside controlled airspace and the gap between Stansted and Luton was entirely blocked by a thunderstorm. Neither Stansted nor Luton would let me through their airspace. They had troubles of their own on such a convective day, but that's different matter. I was outside controlled airspace and had plenty of options, such as rerouting, diverting or holding. I was not their responsibility. So, by how far should we avoid thunderstorms? It does depend whether we are upwind or downwind. Upwind, we can reasonably go within about 5 or 10 nautical miles without danger, but on the downwind side we should avoid it at least by the length of the anvil and probably 10 miles more than that. The anvil can be deceptive as the area underneath appears to be blue sky, but it can be very turbulent and contain rain or hail and should emphatically be avoided. I've talked a lot about avoiding thunderstorms, but what if it all goes wrong and you end up in one? If you do end up in a thunderstorm in northwest Europe, generally it's not going to be too awful or threatening. If you're over the Alps or Apennines, it could be somewhat worse, but the really threatening thunderstorms that we read about ripping aircraft apart are generally found only in the middle of the United States and in the tropics. There is, of course, a continuum. It all depends on the amount of energy in the storm, and that relates to how big it grows before dissipation. It's just more likely to grow threateningly large in the tropics than in northern Europe. The important thing is to ensure that your control movements are gentle and do not exceed the desired limitations of the aircraft. If the POH specifies a turbulence penetration speed, or VB, you should slow down to that. If no such speed is specified, use 80% of the top of the green arc. You should trade accuracy for gentleness. The way I always look at it, if you're fool enough to have found your way into the middle of a thunderstorm, the chances of someone else being in there with you are very remote, and if your altitude varies by a few hundred or 1,000 feet, it's almost certainly not going to matter. On the other hand, if you make violent control inputs for the sake of maintaining your altitude or heading, you're much more likely to create serious problems for yourself. The orthodoxy is that the autopilot should be switched off in turbulence, for fear that it will be over-aggressive in trying to maintain altitude and heading or track. I've no particular evidence to the contrary, but I do sometimes wonder whether that advice was developed in the time of simpler autopilots, and whether, if you have a digital autopilot with envelope protection, it might not be better left engaged, as it will be designed to operate smoothly, possibly more smoothly than you, the pilot, might. If you do have a more sophisticated autopilot and elect to keep it engaged, it's best to select a raw pitch mode or vertical speed set to 0 feet per minute. Use of altitude hold mode should be avoided. If the autopilot does trip off, be prepared to counter a large outer trim force. But I re-emphasize that the official advice is to switch it off, so I can only recommend that you do so. Obviously, de-ice and anti-ice systems should be set to 11, as you're likely to encounter moderate or even severe icing. If you have time, you should secure the cabin, most importantly ensuring that your and your passengers' seatbelts and harnesses are on tight. I've only hit my head on the cockpit roof a couple of times, and that's taught me to make sure I'm well strapped in. If you find yourself in a cell, you need to make your best estimate of the quickest and safest way out. That may be to punch through, it may be to turn possibly as much as 180 degrees. There can be no general advice, you just need to visualize where you think you are compared to any information you have about the location of the cell. If you think the cell is small, you might be best just to keep going. If you are right on the edge of it, it makes more sense to turn away. I can't help much more than that. I think that's all I can say. I hope you found it useful. See you in the next video.